From the campus of the University of Kentucky, you're listening to Behind the Blue. I'm Cody Kaiser with UK Strategic Communications.
It's a little confounding because I think really it's both CPR and AEDs. And I think a lot of this, you kind of have to look at the data and ask yourself, well, when the cardiac arrest occurs, what was the location? Because I think a big challenge we have in our state is we have a very wide variable demographic and geography. Yeah, so this is where grassroots efforts for public health endeavors are really the most important, and you get the biggest bang for your buck by putting things into place. And a good example would be Narcan kits for communities that have been really hit hard by the opioid epidemic. And this is no different. Having access to an AED increases your chance of survival, particularly in resource-poor areas where the infrastructure, where it may be hard for an ambulance to get to you in time. Like even if someone manages to recognize someone going down, starting chest compressions, getting the AED will hopefully increase. And it's been shown that if you increase the access to AEDs, survival from cardiac arrest goes up significantly.
That's Dr. Shaun Mohan, an electrophysiologist and medical director of Project Atom at Kentucky Children's Hospital. His specialty is the electrical function of the heart, particularly in children and young adults. And he's part of a growing national movement to improve survival rates for sudden cardiac arrest through better access to Automated External Defibrillators, or AEDs. Each year in the U.S., hundreds of thousands of cardiac arrests occur outside of hospitals, and survival often hinges on a matter of minutes. AEDs are increasingly common in airports, stadiums, and other high-traffic areas. But many schools, community buildings, and rural spaces still go without, despite data showing that early use of an AED can dramatically improve a person's chance of survival. Through programs like Project Atom, Dr. Mohan and his colleagues are working to close that gap one school at a time. On this episode of Behind the Blue, Dr. Mohan talks about the life-saving potential of AEDs, why public awareness and education are just as important as the technology itself, and what it takes to empower schools and communities to take action before a crisis ever happens. Dr. Shaun Mohan, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. Tell us a little bit about what your role is here with UK Healthcare.
Well, Cody, thank you for having me. So I am one of the doctors at Kentucky Children's Hospital. I came here in 2016, 2017. I'm one of the pediatric heart doctors. Specifically, I'm an electrophysiologist, which essentially means I'm an electrician of the heart. So I'm a cardiologist that specialized in heart problems for children and young people and those with congenital heart disease. And I did extra training to learn about electrical problems of the heart. So, most doctors, you go through med school, you do some basic training to kind of learn a skill set and a knowledge base. And then I decided I liked cardiology, and then I liked electrical problems more. So I decided to do more training. And then I've been here since August of 2016.
That's an interesting way of phrasing it. Usually when people think about electrical problems, they're thinking about the wiring of their house. But in some ways, there's some similarities there, I guess, as far as like
very
the
much so.
electrical.
A lot of times, one of the fun parts of my job is just even chatting with parents and a kid or a teenager to get them to understand what their problem, what the issue is, and what my role is. My common analogy is that the heart is no different than like a house. Your house can have plumbing problems, and that's probably what most people think of when it comes to heart issues, especially in adults, like with clogged vessels or, you need a plumber to kind of clear out some stuff like a roto-rooter, or you need a surgeon to kind of reroute things. But you could also have electrical problems in the house, and you need an electrician involved. Nothing we do is kind of in isolation of our other partners within our field. A lot of times, when we manage complex patients, they both have electrical problems and heart plumbing problems. And, medicine is a lifespan, and some of these patients, they will often, a lot of the young patients we see, they still need lifelong care. And they often need to kind of have that good transition from pediatric cardiology care to adult cardiology care. And that's kind of one of the benefits of our healthcare system, just being a children's hospital within a larger adult medical system.
I recently spoke with Scotty Day from UK Children's Hospital, and we talked a lot about the differences in what attracts people to working in pediatrics versus other, I guess, what could be perceived as more lucrative areas of medicine. Clearly, there was something that drew you to this. What made you want to work with children and young people?
Part of it was personality. I enjoyed the variety of pediatric medicine, and just the energy that the patients bring. Not that there isn't energy in adult medicine, but I think we just see so many more varied medical diseases. I think a lot of adult medicine, there's a lot more acquired heart disease that comes from aging as well as lifestyle. And, you don't have, we often don't see that as much in pediatric medicine, but it starts, stuff like that does show up in the teenage years, depending on if, teenagers get into bad habits. Things that we all kind of know about, whether it's drinking, drug use, smoking, not being active, becoming obese. So I'd say congenital abnormalities are much more common in pediatric medicine because, usually from the get-go when they're born, if they have something very significantly wrong with their heart, and in the year 2025, our obstetric colleagues are really good being able to pick up the stuff like in the second trimester. In a lot of moms when they get their routine, second trimester ultrasound. And then if it's a heart issue, then they get plugged in with a fetal cardiologist, which is kind of one of the other branches of pediatric cardiology. And then from there, if the parents, obviously, they put their trust in the medical care system or whatever gives them strength to cope with that stress, because that can't be easy. Being told that your child has something very significant that could affect their health in long term, then we end up following them pretty much their entire childhood and sometimes even longer. And I think that's a very rewarding thing.
The main thing we want to talk about today is the use and implementation of AED devices, which, if you wouldn't mind, give me an explanation of what that stands for.
Sure. Automated External Defibrillators. So automated external defibrillators are boxes that now we are seeing much more common in public areas, particularly, more often in big metropolitan areas, airports, train stations, universities, even within a hospital, and public schools, hopefully now more and more. The way to think about them, it's no different than having a fire extinguisher. On the chance that there is a cardiac arrest or someone goes down, and the challenge is sometimes you don't know why someone collapses and loses consciousness. I mean, it could be from their heart, it could be a seizure, it could be they choked on a hot dog or a grape, especially in children. That can certainly happen in young kids. And if their heart is not able to pump blood effectively, then it's a way to restore rhythm. It doesn't take away the need for CPR. These are best done in concert with each other. But AEDs have been a growing resource in the United States for the layperson, even because unfortunately, cardiac arrests, occur. There's about 350 to 360,000 per year in the United States, but the majority being adults, which makes sense. There's many more adults with sick hearts and or a cardiac problem they may not be aware of that they just go down. And but it does also happen in young kids. And that's part of the reason my other role within Kentucky Children's is I'm the medical director for Project Adam. So Project Adam was a program that was started in shortly after 2004, and it had its roots in Wisconsin. Adam Lamel was a teenage boy who passed away during a basketball game. And despite the efforts of the school, the coaches, and EMS, with CPR, he could not be resuscitated. And his parents started this program in his memory. So Project Adam stands for Automated Defibrillators in Adam's Memory. And it's been a grassroots effort to work with local communities, public schools, to really get AEDs into the public schools. If you kind of think about the U.S. population on a given weekday, at the school year in particular, Monday through Friday, 20% of the U.S. population is on grounds at a school. Okay, and that includes not just the students, but teachers, administrators. Think about school games, football games or Friday Night Lights, however you want to think about it that way. Cardiac arrests, I think it tugs at the heartstrings when you read about this stuff and you see it on the news, because, people look at athletes and they think about them as the pinnacle of health. So when an athlete goes down, it shakes your confidence and kind of makes you take stock about, oh, geez, maybe I should go see the doctor.
Right, right.
Or maybe I should go make sure my, 15-year-old kid is checked out. Because no one ever expects an athlete to just go down.
Sure.
And I think what brought it out, what made it I don't want to use the term popular, but I think what made sudden cardiac arrest really become more aware was what happened at the Buffalo Bills game.
Right. And I wanted to ask about that. The just from the little bit of research that I've done, like the development of these machines kind of dates back to some degree to the 1970s. There's work that's gone on before that, but you know, the 70s really kind of saw some of this as far as an actual device. It's gotten smarter. But yes, the Cincinnati Bengals Buffalo Bills game from a few years back with Damar Hamlin, a defensive back who was involved in a tackle on a play and collapsed after he stood up and then collapsed. And I think that's probably, the most high-profile introduction that people have had to this type of incident and this type of technology. And so I want to talk about Project Adam, and we'll get to that in a moment. But just from a kind of a basic sense, can you talk about why AEDs are considered to be a person's best chance for survival in an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest beyond just the kind of the shock itself?
The issue is that it's a little confounding because I think really it's both CPR and AEDs. And I think a lot of this, you kind of have to look at the data and ask yourself, well, when the cardiac arrest occurs, what was the location? Because I think a big challenge we have in our state is we have a very wide variable demographic and geography. We outside of Lexington and Louisville, there aren't a lot of quote big major cities. I mean, certainly there's a lot of smaller towns and cities within the state of Kentucky, but especially like as you go southeast into Appalachia, there are a lot of remote areas.
Right.
I mean, there's probably not a whole lot of airports and train stations.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So this is where grassroots efforts for public health endeavors are really the most important, and you get the biggest bang for your buck by putting things into place. And a good example would be Narcan kits for communities that have been really hit hard by the opioid epidemic. If you look at cities like Baltimore would be a great example, just to see like what they're doing there. And this is no different. Having access to an AED increases your chance of survival, particularly in resource poor areas where the infrastructure, where it may be hard for an ambulance to get to you in time. Like even if someone like manages to recognize someone going down, starting chest compressions, getting the AED will hopefully increase. And it's been shown that if you increase the access to AEDs, survival from cardiac arrest goes up significantly.
The American Heart Association states that only about 40% of people who have cardiac arrest in public receive CPR from bystanders, and AEDs, I think possibly even less so, maybe 1 in 10. On the inverse of that, it's estimated that 9 out of 10 victims live if they receive a shock in the first minute.
Yes. That's probably the most important statistic to be aware of, and it shows the importance of AEDs having access to them. But
Sure.
It doesn't take away the need for chest compressions, because when someone goes down, the rationale for why doing CPR is that, well, if the heart's quivering and not beating, you need to help the heart pump and get blood to the brain, because every minute that goes by, your chance of survival goes down significantly before you can restore normal rhythm. And typically, and the challenge is that, you don't know why someone goes down if it was a cardiac arrest. But even in children, thankfully, cardiac arrest as the heart being the cause for why the heart stopped is not as common as in adults. More often, it's usually a respiratory issue. Like, unfortunately, children, like when they get a bad respiratory illness, if they get a bad pneumonia, bronchiolitis, eventually when the lung muscles tire out and the heart starts to slow down, that's when the heart stops. So you got to be able to restore the heart to pump effectively while also trying to support the breathing issues. And so when the heart gets sick, what I'm getting at is that when the heart gets sick, when there's something else going on, that's when the heart stops. So in order to, you kind of have to reverse, you have to kind of go back into your time machine and restore heart function, do CPR, get the AED, and then you can troubleshoot cause after the fact.
What do you think some of the biggest barriers are from your perspective that are preventing more people from both administering CPR and also using AEDs?
Part of it is fear, because I think people are scared to even consider, to use, technology is daunting.
Sure.
If, I guess, to not insult like grandparents, it's kind of like the first time you give them a smartphone. So the idea, I think just coming out of your comfort zone, and the thought that, that there's an AED, I can understand like why people would be like, well, let's wait for EMS to get here. They don't want to cause or make things worse.
Right.
But AEDs specifically have gotten better over time as far as their design and the way they work. They were designed for the layperson. They weren't designed for a doctor to use or even for an EMT to use. And they are automated. There's amazing features like that make them more automated. They have pictures, like when you open up an AED out of the box, like when, let's say it happens in an airport or a school, they have pictures that show how to apply the pads. You turn it on and there's a voice that says, okay, analyzing rhythm. Okay, continue CPR. All right. Shockable rhythm, continue CPR, charging, clear patient. So like that way, for people who may not have the right literacy, and healthcare literacy is also a big issue, particularly like as you move away from metropolitan areas. Unfortunately, health literacy is a big problem in the United States, in many geographic regions. I don't think that's unique to Kentucky. I think that's many places.
Sure.
And that also scares a lot of people as well, because, like I said, I think it's more unfamiliarity, fear, and but I think it's our job at a public health level to educate, because it's amazing what communities can do when you empower them. And part of that is just, being able, like grassroots efforts like Project Adam, being able to work with schools, and because there's a lot of, AEDs are designed for the layperson, so it doesn't have to be the school nurse applying it. A gym teacher can do it, a teacher, even the school peers can do it.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's something interesting to point out. You've mentioned this, and I think it's very good to reiterate that these are not designed for medical professionals. They're designed for lay people. The things that I was reading were emphasizing that anyone, even a child, can use this device because it provides those clear instructions. It has the kind of the graphical instructions. I want to talk too about the idea of the fear of making things worse through, causing more injury or causing more harm. Some people are afraid of legal liabilities, and we have Good Samaritan laws that are, on the books that are designed to protect people. Is that part of the literacy kind of thing of like people being afraid that they're going to?
Probably, but I will admit I probably am not well versed enough I don't want to make global generalizations.
Sure.
But I think it's a possible explanation. There are probably others as well. But yeah, I would say just from the families that I've interacted with, and when we've gone out into the communities and talked about AEDs and the importance of awareness for sudden cardiac arrest and putting these safeguards in place, I think a lot of it is that people are scared. They think that they have to take a formal course in order to actually do CPR. No, you can do hands-only CPR, while someone is grabbing the AED. You can find YouTube videos like through Project Adam and the American Heart Association, and that's where I kind of wanted to emphasize that CPR with AED is your best option. It's not just the AED alone. If you have that, great. I mean, it's like you said, it can improve your odds of survival, up to 90% if you can get it quickly. But it's really both.
And some of the things I was reading were kind of taking the approach of, as far as the fear of making it worse or causing further harm or injury, once this person is hooked up to the machine and the machine does its analysis, and advises you to do compressions, the idea there being you can't do the person's heart has stopped. If the machine determines this, clinically, technically, the person is dead.
Right.
I mean,
yeah, if they don't have a pulse, then yeah, you have to do CPR.
Right.
You have to get the AED. So I mean, like, you're not going to make it any worse.
Exactly. Right. And so I think that's the interesting thing to think about that. Also, tied in with that idea of, I think oftentimes people think I'm not qualified, somebody else can step up to do this. But really, I think it's important to emphasize when an incident happens like this, that it's important for everybody that's around to try to do some part. And that may be hands-on with the person, using the machine, maybe somebody finding the machine while someone else is trying to assess the situation. But even so much as somebody making the phone call to 911.
Oh yeah, it's that phrase, it takes a village.
Right.
I mean, like, when if we look at CPR training through the American Heart Association, there are recommendations on if you are the only person who saw someone go down, they actually say, go ahead, check a pulse, start CPR, and obviously check a pulse again, then you go try to call EMS. But if there's two people, you send someone to go call EMS, the other person should start CPR. So the emphasis on both is CPR, pulse immediately, get the AED, because we don't know how long it's going to take for EMS to arrive. So whatever you can do as far as trying to restore their heart electrical rhythm, their heart function, just getting blood to the brain, that's going to help. The other thing also with communities, there's literature out there about using medical drones to get AEDs actually to remote communities. So, that's just something to consider. But obviously this is going to require more than just local communities. It's assistance from the state and local governments, which, no different than this is the stuff that should be brought up at town halls, and also be considered in local elections, like when it comes to public funding, which I know right now is a very tenuous climate.
Well, and that's something that I wanted to bring up. Part of the reason why you and I are having this conversation is that this whole interest in this, from my perspective, came from the office that I work in and several of my coworkers talking about the fact that we do not have one of these devices in our building, and we were like exploring what steps we needed to take in order to get one. Is cost a prohibitive factor in some of this? I know we talk about schools and government buildings and airports, train stations, things like that, but just for general, like from a corporate standpoint or places like that, are there cost holdbacks, or are there grant programs, things like that people can?
A little bit of both. So yes, AEDs aren't exactly like, going to replace a pair of AirPods, sorry. So yeah, they can be upwards like anywhere from $500 to $1,200. And there's also different vendors. The issue that we often have to bring up with schools when we're trying to empower them with becoming heart safe and having a cardiac preparedness response plan is that, and we thought about this when we started our Project Adam chapter here a few years ago. Someone brought up the question, well, could we provide them with an AED? Well, it's kind of that phrase, give a man a fish versus teach a man how to fish.
Right.
Once you have the AED, there needs to be an infrastructure in place, maintaining them, making sure they work. I mean, this is a thing that can potentially shock you if you have a shockable rhythm to restore the normal electrical activity of the heart, which means there's a battery.
Sure.
Which means that it needs to be maintained and checked. No different than when you have fire extinguishers in a school, right. Someone should be checking those.
Or the smoke detectors, checking the batteries, things like that. Yep.
Yeah. So there's the cost element, but then there's also having the infrastructure to make sure it's working. I mean, right. There's no point in having fire extinguishers if they're 7 years old and, they're expired.
Right. Right. So in talking about that, I want to talk a little bit about Project Adam and Heart Safe School designations. Can you talk a little bit about what the mission is and kind of what it means to become a heart safe school, to have that designation?
Sure. So in order to become a heart safe school, you need to have AEDs on site, and how many you need to have is kind of a moving target because it depends on how big your school is. It also depends on how your school is laid out. Some private schools have more than one campus location. So it probably makes sense. You probably want your AEDs in areas what you would consider more vulnerable for where someone would likely have a cardiac arrest. Sports field, like a stadium, or, the clubhouse, like where people go get snacks like in the middle of a game, as well as the gymnasium or, in an auditorium, because it's not just a child or an athlete that's, at a game like could go down with a cardiac arrest. It could be grandpa in the stand or the audience. So they need to have AEDs on site. They also need to have the infrastructure. They have to show that they have an infrastructure in place that, someone is checking these AEDs periodically, and also that they do drills. So like if someone actually goes down, that they have a system in place for how are you going to notify EMS? Like who's going to grab the AED? Who's going to start CPR? And Project Adam actually, they've made this they've done a great job, like over the course of 20 years. They actually have a checklist that, individual chapters, like, so for our Kentucky Children's Project Adam team, we engage the school. Sometimes it's actually through people within our institution, because most of us have kids. We have children that are in public schools, private school, people that are involved in the PTA or local booster clubs, and it just requires one person making contact with someone at the school. And some schools it will, the question is, does it fall to the school nurse or someone at the administration level? And that can vary school to school, and also if it's public versus private. And we kind of engage them. And we asked, would you guys be interested in us coming to kind of like take a tour of your school, kind of go over what's your plan in place, in order to have a cardiac preparedness response plan. After the Damar Hamlin incident from a few years ago, the Kentucky legislature passed a bill mandating that all schools be heart safe in order to have a plan in place. And, I think there have been discussions and, since about, how are public schools going to get AEDs? It's one thing to put a mandate saying schools have to be heart safe, having AEDs. It's another, well, okay, who's going to pay for it?
Sure.
So that's something that I think those discussions are still ongoing, but we've been proud to say that we were able to get every public high school in Fayette County heart safe.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. So, but there's still work to be done. I think, we still have to kind of go for the middle schools, the elementary schools, Woodford County. And, we have partners in Norton Children's as well. They have a Project Adam chapter and they're working in their local communities. But yeah, this is a statewide thing, which it's kind of fun and proud to kind of be at the beginning of all.
And much like we were talking about fire extinguishers, smoke alarms, things like that, having someone on site designated to kind of tend to that or shepherd that process. I would assume too that they can reach out to Project Adam, find a chapter close to them that can help them with this process. Yeah. But then I'm assuming they could also even speak with their local fire department, EMTs.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Our job is, I think when we started our Project Adam chapter, I think we were, many of us who were very passionate about this public health endeavor was, we did not want to act like policemen. Sure. It's not our job to come in with a mandate saying you have to do it this way, because I think every school is unique in their community as far as their community resources, their infrastructure. There are some schools that have student bodies of 50 people in their graduating class. Mm-hmm. There are some that have 300. And like I said, some schools have more than one campus location. So Project Adam has a checklist and guidelines. And, so part of also being heart safe is, we do kind of a site assessment, kind of pointing out, well, you got that staircase over there and, you got, that kind of is at the intersection of this hallway, that'd be a good place for an AED. Your school has a special needs program. Well, right, definitely you want to take that into consideration for a cardiac response plan, maybe like having an AED definitely in that wing, as well as the gym and other areas too. And when they feel that they're ready, they reach out to us and then we try to find a date on the calendar, and usually a team of us from Kentucky Children's Project Adam, which is usually like 4 or 5 of us, will go and we simulate a drill. Where with a mannequin, with with a AED, and we basically go through a checklist of, all right, person went down. How soon was EMS called? How soon did you start CPR? We try to give them feedback, and there obviously has to be some objectivity to it. So they have to meet certain points and check marks, and that's how they become heart safe. But the next part of that is actually, I'm proud of the fact that we were able to get every public high school heart safe. The next step is now making sure that they're doing that at least once a year.
Mm-hmm. And I can see too where a lot of communities who are doing community programs for CPR training, basic first aid training, things like that, would want to be able to incorporate this into it. And I can see where another big area where this would be needed would be also churches and places of worship.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, actually, a lot of the data that I mentioned about using drones was actually for remote rural areas, and getting it to like a church, like where that would be a very large public venue where potentially someone could have a cardiac arrest.
So given that, like you mentioned, the 20% of a community's population basically would be in their schools, and the high profile of these cases with young athletes, things like that. How do you see the work you're doing with Project Adam moving forward as far as efforts for, cardiac incident preparedness? I guess in a big picture, kind of what are maybe the next year to 5-year kind of plan for Project Adam?
So as much as I'm proud of the work we've done in Fayette County, I think the biggest hurdle now is moving outside of Fayette County, because obviously, 99% of the time I'm physically here, and it takes time. It's hard to find schedules to align with schools, and getting a team of people for us to go out there and visit, do that site assessment, and then also come back for a drill. So you're looking at 2 visits, and this is probably where now telehealth, Zoom, Teams is going to be very helpful, because we may not necessarily have to be there on on site in person to do a needs assessment as far as like, what's the vulnerability like as far as your specific school infrastructure and your resources, as where you should put AEDs, how many. But it definitely requires us at least going out in person once, especially for doing the formal drill itself and going through the checklist. I think that's going to be the biggest challenge, like, because it was daunting, but we managed to cover all the schools, the public schools in Fayette County. Now it's moving beyond Fayette County, I think, is going to be the hard part.
If someone's listening to this and they think this is all very good stuff, I want to move forward with this for my church, my place of work, my whatever in my community, how does one go about, I guess, contacting Project Adam, or what?
Sure.
Like the
So
first steps?
Project Adam, I have to state, is specifically for schools. I think if it was, if your local community, I mean, most communities have a school, the easiest thing would be your local police and EMS department. In order to kind of figure out, and I think, like I said, in those situations, it may be harder as far as getting the funds to procure an AED, but it's more than just paying for the AED. You have to be sure that you have a system in place, that it's being maintained, and doing drills no different than you would for a fire drill. I think that's going to be something for communities where you don't have a large, school full of young people, because at least Project Adam, specifically the focus is for schools, just because obviously of Adam Lamel's unfortunate story and origins.
Probably the biggest takeaway from some of this is that this is a step that communities can take that can reduce easily preventable deaths because of these, this preparation and these steps and this.
Sure.
Kind of
and, this is something that even going beyond Project Adam, like, if your local Girl Scout or Boy Scout troop is looking for a community project, this would be a great thing to do for your community.
Fantastic. I guess one final summary message that you'd want to leave people with as far as to the public and what their role might be in responding to this, and maybe encouragement for helping people feel empowered to act in these situations.
Don't try to be overwhelmed about an AED. I think you can, it's amazing what the power of a community can do. And I think people sell themselves short all the time. We sometimes have parents here's an EpiPen if your kid has anaphylaxis from a bee sting, or if you are hypoglycemic, here's a glucagon kit. I would say AEDs are not that dissimilar. You're not putting a needle in someone. So, as scary as it sounds and as it seems, this is where ask the question. And, I'm sure your local fire stations, EMS, and policemen, they are more than welcome to help. I think this is where community matters, and engaging our local resources is going to have the biggest bang for buck. Excellent stuff. Dr. Shaun Mohan, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And, hope you have more continued success with Project Adam and getting the word out. All right. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Behind the Blue. Behind the Blue is a joint production of the University of Kentucky and UK Healthcare. For more stories about UK and UK healthcare, visit uknow.uky.edu.